Ladies and gentlemen, a distinct pleasure to be invited into the Army hearth, if you will. I think we have a lot to do over the next hour and a half. I'm ask your indulgence as I get the first 15 minutes. And I'm going to hit you with a small blizzard of pictures and maps, trying to, if you will, get into the operational environment from strategic to tactical of Russia, primarily from a historical and geographical perspective. Then we have this elite panel here that will get into the eaches of politics, society, nuts and bolts of the military, and futures issues. So again, a lot to do over the next hour and a half, and let's jump into it. First, Russian Federation. I'm trying to get you a little bit into the mind what some things I believe might help us understand better what drives them into the way they see the world, their behaviors seemingly unfathomable. I never purport to understand the Russians because I don't live in their skin, but I spent a lot of time trying to. So, first, all of you have seen this map thousands of times. But let's take a step back because I'm going to be working at this level, and I will do this basically in variations at high school level up to PhD to senior general officer level because I think it's important to do the review. Ladies and gentlemen, 11 time zones, all right? And while size is often seen as a strength, I would submit in Russia's case, it is also vulnerability, and they see it that way as well. And how they balance that is very important. Just to give, again, you've seen this, but just take a look at it. And when we get into issues of economy and population and all of that, they're playing quite a shell game, I would submit. All right, just another, wrap your head around. As ground guys, the distance is longer terrestrially, and we think primarily terrestrially in this audience, to take the Trans-Siberian Railroad from Moscow to Vladivostok than it takes to fly from Dulles to Honolulu, if I can help you with that geospatially, okay? And remarkably, they built the bulk of that railroad before World War I. How about a country that basically 50 to 60% of it is barely functional from a nature perspective, permafrost, and it creates major problems for them, obviously, to include how you run your gas pipelines. Down from it. Don't tell the Russians that there isn't climate change because it's bubbling and methane and they've got issues there. How about arable terrain? Russia is very, if you will, from its agriculturally perspective, very southern and southwestern centric. Now, they are beating the sanctions on the agricultural side because it's a sieve of foodstuffs and all that coming up from Caucasus, Central Asia, and the People's Republic of China. But this is a challenge for them. Railroads, again, thinking terrestrially, thinking command and control, thinking of shunting reserves of an army, which is pretty big, but guess what, friends? Not that big relative to the space, and certainly they've got population challenges. And look at that rail net. It is centric to the Urals to the west and runs in tendrils close to the Chinese border. Okay, I do this with really informed people. I'll ask them, how big is the Russian population in your mind? And some, I'll get numbers as high as 350, 400 million people. That's sort of what the old Soviet Union close to. But ladies and gentlemen, 145 million people, plus or minus a few million. How about 40% of that in the United States, 1/3 of the European Union, 500 million. And how about 1/8 to 1/9 of the People's Republic of China? at 1.3 billion approximately. That's, oh, and how about 75 to 80% of that population west, in and west of the Ural Mountains? So they have not only a demography problem numerically, but also spatially. And how do you work all this? And so when I start to talk about its size as being as much a vulnerability as a benefit, I think that's important. Oh, by the way, much of Russia was carved out of the hides and carcasses of other nations and civilizations. And they are living with that legacy today. How about, and I use the Soviet slide just to give you, because you see how it works over the border, but the population density, another look, just how Western-centric it is, and a bit toward the south-southwest. And the growth rates in population, Russia has turned the population around. It's a slight growth now. But right deep through the chaotic 90s, it had plummeted, where birth rates significantly had started to fall behind death rates. In the red, in the west, they are still they're still behind the curve, and then the farther south and all that you go, the more balanced or improved the population is. And that kind of gives you a slide of what happened during this chaotic period that really gets at the core of what the Russians see and think. And so I think that these are important things, because you know what? If you have 145 million people, your budget isn't that big. You have also issues on fully staffing in peacetime, if you will, all contract force. And Dr. Carver touched on the fact that conscripts now are a major challenge. How about 30% of the Russian military, plus or minus, are conscripts? Active duty, about 900,000. Now, they can call in reservists and all that. You've got the 250,000 National Guard. You've got big security services. But they have to really do some balancing here. Right now, they're stacked in the west, in a defensive posture in the east, and in part because they've worked some transactional deals with the Chinese. Here's another set. This gigantic, massive country. Look at where it is on that pie chart. I think it's important to look at them geospatially, and
we're going to turn your table mic on so that we're not stationary.
Oh, okay, no problem. All right, now Russia is as multi-ethnic as we are. I just touched on that, and so it's got some balancing there. Basically, in Russia, if you behave yourself and you're not a white Russian, you will be okay. But if you start getting extremists, or you're proselytizing, not just in Islam but in Christianity, they will make it very, very hard. Russia and Islam, it's not as high as it was, but there is concern about continued growth, if you will, of a Muslim minority, mostly, overwhelmingly secular. But you have Dagestan, you have Chechnya, you have fighters down in Syria with ISIS and Iraq, and it was a Kalmykian radicalized guy that blew himself up in 2017 in the Leningrad-St. Petersburg metro, killing 9 people. So they're watching. Now, this is also about China. We don't have time to get into a lot of stuff. But that, how about a border with China about the size of our border with Canada? Now, you see these areas in the pink and brown. These were taken from the Chinese in unpopular agreements in the mid-1800s. They were agreements, but they were forced agreements. And that is an issue still among Chinese nationalists. The Russians are aware. They've got both sides of prudent, if you will, transactional foreign policy in my mind. I was just out on the border along the Amur last November. Yes, there are populations in there that are that kind of coexist, but they're not integrated at all. It's like, as one Russian university student, postgrad, about 24, said after spending half a year out in China studying Chinese and the culture, said it was a great experience. They were really, really cordially, but it was like living on another planet. And this is from a Russian out in that area. I don't want to overstate it, but they're different. And I believe that, in fact, in the core relations, if you throw the politics aside, Russians and U.S., in my experience, almost always get along very well at the basic level. However, now we just have a few minutes, and I wanted to get at the sort of where the Russians are, if you will, the psychology of existential threats. Think bookends, and it's a narrative that's hard for us to understand. Almost 1,000 years ago, the Mongols come and raise Russia and drive Rus, which is Kiev, and it is a conflict of annihilation. That's something we haven't experienced. However, that we talk about ancient history, Russia was in a conflict of annihilation, the Soviet Union, within the lifetime of the surviving grandparents today. And the fight against the Nazis was existential. In a way, I don't think any of us could. It was fought over Russian villages, and how about and millions, 20 to 26 million died. You had all the Stalin stuff in between, the revolution. How about 40 million people unnaturally dead between 1914 and 54? And that might help us, maybe, why the suspicion, the xenophobia, the distrust. And as I would argue as an attaché in Russia, but you know the West is no threat. Come on, with 3 brigades. Old grandmother grabbed me, with Smolensk. Remember, in my lifetime as a little girl, the Nazis came from the West and millions of us died. So, when you're talking Russians, there is a visceral thing about them that I think is very, very hard for our society and diplomats to fathom. By the way, it doesn't excuse any of their egregious behaviors, of which they've been considerable, especially since 14. I'm down to 3 minutes. All right, they win the war. They win the war. We win the war. But they sweep into the Warsaw Pact. They're resurgent. They're licking their wounds. And the expansion goes on for a while, but it is also a buffer zone. The east border to Leningrad is 800 miles now. But what happens? Within the night after Christmas in 1991, it falls apart. And that border now, that used to be in the middle of Germany with NATO enlargement, is now 80 miles from St. Petersburg instead of 800. By the way, I am a fervent NATO guy. Don't let me in any way try to create somehow a perception I'm against it. But the grievance, the aggrieved aspect of the Russians lives today. As we know, imagine we talk about having 14 or 15 republics slough away if you're whatever a great Russian. Now, imagine you're a Russian in the Baltics or in some of the other locations, and all of a sudden you're a minority and they hate you. However, that gives the Russian regime opportunities to feed on that. I love this slide because it kind of, a lot of the problem children, there have been success stories, came out of this period. And then we all know about Putin's statement in 2007. I believe it was a geostrategic roadmap in his mind. I don't know, but I think we could say it was a bit of a blueprint. NATO enlargement, I've already talked about it. I'm a NATO guy. These countries deserved to come in. I tell that to the Russians, they don't buy it. That is a Russian, I was at Russian Security Conference 2017. That is a portrayal. We're all in there as internationals taking pictures of how they see global missile defense and how it encircles Russia. Again, I'm giving you a perspective from their world. Doesn't mean it's one I believe. Arctic, the only thing I'm going to say, it's melting. The Northern Sea Road, but look at that blue thing called the North. It's basically the Northern Fleet Military District. That was created in 2015 And I think that came in and went under the radar. All right, hybrid operations, gray zone. I just throw this slide up. They understand they've got a lot of problems in a straight fight. So how do you undermine? And I think this is a great, picture tells 1,000 words. I was just in the Balkans 3 days ago. This is actually a Kosovar image of how Russia uses Serbia to, if you will, disrupt in the Western Balkans. I did gray zone stuff again. Finally, there's Russian bear, It's kind of, and this is to reassure the population. He's looking at his NATO's expansion. Behind him is a box. The tendrils cut off the tentacles. The Nazis, the Swedes, the Poles, and everybody. We've seen this before. We'll deal with it when the time comes. And when all else fails, we are in an important time. IMF is gone, and New Start is on life support. It goes away in February 21. The nuclear thing, and this is what keeps them as a superpower. We don't have time to get into it. I'm going to stop here. But I wanted to give you this very, very overview. And as I say, go back to basics of history and geography, because I think of any big country in the world, they are about their history and their geography. Okay, we ready for another round? Okay, I'd like to introduce Brian Whitmore, who I recently have gotten to know over at the Center for European Policy Analysis, CEPA. Really an up-and-coming, fast-moving think tank focused on Europe. He is a prolific writer, speaker, write this down, he has his Power Vertical blog, and he is the host of the Power Vertical podcast. He is CEPA's top Russia guy, and does all kinds of other academic stuff, a lot of time in Russia. And with that, and he's going to talk primarily from a societal, political view to fill in the many gaps that left behind. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter.
Good start.
Yeah, no, that sets me up really nice. Thank you, Peter, and thank you to the Association of the United States Army for the invitation. It's truly an honor to be here. That really set up well. We didn't plan this, but this sets me up really nicely because I want to talk about the systemic nature of the conflict that we're in right now. We don't have a Putin problem. We have a Russia problem. And Putin is a manifestation of that Russia problem. And one of the favorite parlor games of people like me is to figure out what's going to happen after 2024. Is Putin going to stay or is Putin going to go? And if he goes, who's going to follow him? But guess what? It doesn't really matter, actually. I would argue that it doesn't really matter. Because what our problem with Russia right now is a systemic conflict between two normative systems. And that systemic conflict existed before Putin, and it's going to exist after Putin. And I would argue that this systemic problem, it didn't manifest itself as an open conflict, even existed during the 90s. We had two normative systems that are basically facing off against each other right now. One to the west is based in institutions. It's based on the rule of law. It's based on transparency, accountability, individual rights, the sanctity of contracts. And just because we don't always live up to these ideals doesn't mean these ideals do not form the foundation and the basis of our system. The Russian system, or as I call it, the sistema, and I borrow that term from the emigre political scientist Elena Ledeneva, who coined it in her book, Can Russia Modernize? The answer was an emphatic no due to the existence of sistema. Sistema is based on patronage. It's based on patron-client relationships. It's based on networks of influence. It's based on institutionalized kleptocracy. And this is an important thing to understand. Corruption is not a bug in the Russian system. It is a feature. It's based on oligarchy. It's based on Potemkin institutions. One of the first things you notice in Russia, and I think, Peter, you would agree with me, is this: you start to see the formalities working, and they mean nothing. They mean absolutely nothing. They have all these things that have the same names of things we have. They have a president and courts and parliaments, but they don't do the same thing. Right? So Potemkin institution. You have the subordination of law and institutions to power, and this effectively results in a system of arbitrary rule, a system where might makes right. And there's examples I can give. We're in the West, we play by the rules. In Russia, they play with the rules. This is an important distinction to understand. Anybody who's been foolish enough to sign a contract in the Russian Federation knows what I'm talking about. I was foolish enough to sign a contract in the Russian Federation. In the West, when you sign a contract, that is a sacred document. I just refinanced my mortgage. I felt they were going to have the ceremony in a cathedral. The contract is sacred. And if it's violated, it's enforceable in an impartial court of law. Well, in Russia, if you sign a contract, that contract is enforceable to the extent that you have a good krisha. Now, krisha in the Russian language means roof, literally, but it means in kind of in colloquial Russian, it means protection. It means you have an official or an organized crime boss who is your protection. And if you have a stronger krisha than the person with whom you signed a contract, then that contract is certainly enforceable. If your krisha is weaker than the other krisha, then that contract is a worthless piece of paper. I learned that my contract was a worthless piece of paper because I didn't even know I needed a krisha when I signed mine. This is an example of the system where might makes right. Another example that illustrates this is actually a pretty funny one. In my time in Russia in the 90s, there was this computer game called Civilization that was popular at the time, where you built a civilization and you had to balance bread, guns and butter, and develop your technology and develop your culture. And I was playing with these Russian guys, and I was noticing their money never ran out, their armies never ran out, and I was like, God, they must be really good at this game, until I figured out they were hacking the game as we were playing. This is in the early 90s, and these were like Russian teenagers. They were hacking the game. And I said, well, what's the point of hacking the game? And that kind of defeats the entire purpose of playing, because you're supposed to try to build a civilization. But to them, the hacking was the ability to hack the game. Again, we play by the rules, they play with the rules, and I think this is an important distinction. Now, the Russian systema is not new. It has endured from the time of the Grand Duchy of Muscovy, through the Russian Federation, through the Soviet Union, and through the Russian Empire, through the Soviet Union, and through the post-Soviet Russian Federation. This is nothing new at all. The poet Nikolai Karamazin, who was once asked, what are people doing in Russia? He just said, they steal. This was a Russian nobleman who was saying this. So this isn't some criticism that was coming out of the West. I was recently reading the Edward Keenan's Muscovite Political Folkways, which I would recommend anybody read. It's a book about court politics in the Grand Duchy of Muscovy. And it was actually commissioned as something for the CIA back in the 80s. Now it's public. And it's a wonderful monograph, but when I read it, the thing that strikes me is how little has changed. There's one kind of passage from it that I find really, really telling. He said, Russian court politics in the 15th century is marked by extreme forms of ceremonial camouflage and secrecy, and the assiduous production of noise in which the realities of an informal corporate and oligarchic political system were masked by a facade of complex protocol, hierarchic nomenclature, and ecclesiastical trappings elaborated with great intensities and false circumstance. This could have been a description of the politics of Putin's court. It could have been a description of Boris Yeltsin's inner circle. It could have been a description of Leonid Brezhnev's Politburo. It could have been a description of Nicholas I's court. But it was a description of 15th century Muscovy. So this is systema. It operates based on corruption, networks of influence, patronage. And during the Cold War, this was not our problem. During the Cold War, this was not our problem at all, because it was hermetically sealed behind the Iron Curtain. But in the age of globalization, it has very much become our problem. Because while in the 90s we believed that globalization would carry Western values and Western liberalism to the East, and it has to a degree, what has also happened is that the values of systema are spreading into our systems as well, right? And one of the things that Putin has done with systema is he has weaponized it. He has corralled it, and he has weaponized it. So if during the Yeltsin period, Sistema was balkanized and diffuse, but you had signs that it was existing. You had the Bank of New York scandal, which billions were laundered through the Bank of New York of Russian mafia money. You had Russian organized crime groups arming both sides of the civil war in Georgia, or of so-called patriotic groups in Crimea. You had cigarette smugglers surveilling the Estonian-Russian border. What Putin has discovered is that he can centralize and weaponize this against the West. So now the threat against the West is not just kinetic, it's also non-kinetic, because we have weaponized organized crime, we have weaponized corruption, we have weaponized finance, and the favorite topic of this town, weaponized information. Although I like to point out that the weaponized information does not exist in a vacuum. It exists in an ecosystem. And it exists in an ecosystem in which corruption and organized crime create the atmosphere in which disinformation and other forms of malign influence can flourish. And I actually published at SIPA last year a study that actually scientifically looked at this, looked at how the levels of corruption in a country are directly correlated to that country's susceptibility to Russian malign influence and disinformation operations. It was called Putin's Dark Ecosystem, Graft Gangsters and Active Measures, and you can find it on the SIPA website. So what all of this weaponization of globalization that Putin has, how Putin has corralled the Sistema, this is added to the Russian doctrine of strategic patience. Right? Strategic patience is a key element of Russian strategic doctrine, the idea being that they will just wear us down, that Ukraine is more important to them than it is to us. Georgia is more important to them than it is to us. Belarus is more important to them than it is to us. And I would argue they would think that even Poland and the Baltic states are more important to them than it is to us. Therefore, they can just wear us down. What this weaponization of all these non-kinetic aspects of Russia's arsenal is doing is shortening the window. It's an attempt to shorten the window of strategic patience. And this is where the kinetic and the non-kinetic begin to merge. Now, the way I argue that we should answer this, and this is part of a much broader project I'm working on now that I'm seeking funding for, is with something I call hybrid containment. There's all this talk of hybrid warfare, and we're all kind of tired probably of hearing that term, and nobody's even quite sure what it actually means. I argue we need to answer this with something I call hybrid containment, and that is containing the kinetic threat and containing the non-kinetic threat. Containing Russian tanks, but also containing Russian banks, if you will, because we are as threatened by Russian banks today as we are by Russian tanks. And the farther west you get, the more important the banks become and the less important the tanks become, right? Now, on the kinetic front, I see a lot of uniforms in the audience. I am one of the few civilians in the room. I will leave the containing the kinetic part to you experts. This is not where I shine. I mean, I think things like enhanced forward presence are certainly contributing to this, but I'll leave the kinetic part to you. What I want to focus on is the non-kinetic part, because I think we need to start thinking about how to shore up our defenses in finance, election security, organized crime. All of these things are now defense issues. Corruption is a defense and security issue. I'm fond of saying that corruption is the new communism, that Putin's black cash is indeed the new red menace. And so I think we need to start thinking about this, and the first thing I would say is resilience through reform. Right? Since the 1980s and 90s, we have deregulated our economies and deregulated our societies to the point where there are gaping security holes there. Again, it goes back to this assumption that in the age of globalization, it is good things that are going to spread through the global economy. Well, now we're learning that it's also bad things that are spreading through the globalized economy. Vladimir Putin did not invent offshore. He did not invent shell companies. But he is using these things. He did not invent money laundering. But he is using these things to create networks of influence that are corroding our systems. And we have to start thinking about, and this is not a political statement, although it is often interpreted as being politicized because, let's face it, the right favors deregulation and the left favors greater regulation. This has to be moved out of the realm of politics. And we have to start thinking about smart regulation in order to prevent this corrosive capital from entering our system that is, undermining our security. We have to clean up the state of Delaware, and we have to clean up the city of London. And we have to clean up all sorts of other offshore zones. We have to talk about beneficial ownership and also all sorts of things that are now need to be part of the national security discussion. We have to rethink the concept of deterrence. I remember back in 2014 when I asked a general, I was at NATO headquarters, and I asked a NATO general, if you had a little green men situation pop up in Estonia right now, would that be an Article 5 situation? And at that time, that general was not able to answer that question. And I followed it up with, why wasn't the 2007 cyber attack on Estonia an Article 5 situation? And again, I couldn't get an answer. But now, I mean, the alliance has moved leaps and bounds since that day. Right now, I would get an unambiguous, yes, that is an Article 5 situation. And the cyber attack on Estonia is a potential Article 5 situation. But we need to kind of create a system of deterrence now, because there's no or else. Russia was able to conduct a cyber attack on Estonia, interfere in not just the American, but elections across the Western world with impunity, because there was no or else. And we have to kind of institutionalize an or else. Ambassador Daniel Fried and my colleague Edward Lucas came up with, I think, this awesome idea of SNAP financial exercises, right? Militaries have exercises all the time, right? But what if we had a SNAP financial exercise in which we demonstrated very loudly what assets we would freeze, what bank accounts we would seize, what buildings we would take over in the event of Russian aggression against the United States or any of its allies, kinetic or non-kinetic, right? These are the bank accounts we would freeze. That would get their attention. Cyber. Imagine if the alliance demonstrated, now you get funny looks when you say this at NATO headquarters because we officially don't do cyber offense. I get that. But what if we demonstrated what the alliance can do in terms of a cyber attack in retaliation for a cyber attack on us, right, on the United States or any of its allies? We have to begin to show the Russians that there is an or else to this, and that we view these non-kinetic attacks as threats to our national security. We need an early warning system. We have early warning systems for nuclear war. We have early warning systems for terrorism, as we should. But we do not have an early warning system for weaponized corruption. We do not have an early warning system for weaponized organized crime. We need I say kind of a new DEFCON system for the non-kinetic world. So when a top political operative in a Western country who is associated with one of the major political parties in that country, and I'm not mentioning anybody by name on purpose here, when such a person is working for an oligarch from a hostile foreign power and is not filing his FBAR to the Internal Revenue Service, red flags should be going up in the IRS, but red flags should also be going up in the NSA, quite frankly, because this is a potential security threat down the road. When a Russian cigarette smuggling ring is caught in eastern Estonia is caught surveilling the border, and it is smuggling cigarettes with the assistance of the Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation. This should raise alarm bells. This did raise alarm bells with the Estonians, because a Russian cigarette smuggling ring run out of eastern Estonia around 2015 was not only surveilling the border, it was also being used to create black cash that could be used to finance other Russian operations across Europe, and the Estonians were onto this, to their credit. But we have to begin to be very attentive to these things very early when they may not look like national security threats at the time. You have to lower the DEFCON level from 5 to 4 to 3 to 2 to 1. The Lithuanians are very good at this. They have a hybrid war room in the basement of their Ministry of Defense, and they give awesome briefings there about how they do this. It's everything from looking at investments to looking at social media posts to looking at activities in the financial sector, and they don't call it DEFCON, but they are saying, where is the threat level rising or lowering? What do we have to do here while still respecting our citizens' constitutional rights? They have banned Yandex Taxi, for example, which is like the Uber of the Russian Federation in Lithuania. The reason was that Yandex Taxi was effectively hoovering up everybody's information when you ordered a taxi from your smartphones. They were putting malware on people's smartphones and hoovering up their data. So again, this is something as banal as ordering a taxi has been weaponized, right? So we have to think in terms of that. We have to start thinking in terms of excluding Russia from the benefits of globalization, because effectively we have a revisionist power here that is only able to challenge and threaten us because they have access to Western technology in the Western financial system. So we maybe need to start thinking about things like COCOM, the Cold War Area Coordinating Committee that forbade the sale of any dual-use technology to the Soviet Union or its allies. Now, Silicon Valley would scream bloody murder if they couldn't sell their iPhones to the huge Russian market. But Silicon Valley did fine before they were selling things to the Russian market, and I think they'll continue to do fine. But I think we need to start thinking in these terms. We have to start thinking about why we're allowing the buying and selling of Russian sovereign debt on our exchanges. And the nuclear weapon in this arsenal is a SWIFT ban. Talk of a SWIFT ban, talk of banning the Russians from the SWIFT system has been thrown about in the past rather loosely. I think it's something we have to be very careful about. And I call it the financial nuke for a reason, because if you did ban Russia from the SWIFT system, it would have devastating effects on the economies of our European allies. And this is something we have to be very sensitive to. We would kind of get out of it unscathed, but our European allies would be hit very hard by a SWIFT ban. But we have to start thinking in terms of these things. And this is a work in progress. And the nice thing about these presentations is you get to talk about things while they're still cooking and get good feedback about how the meal would taste. The final thing I want to say, and what's relevant for all of the uniformed people in the room, is that we have to start beginning to start thinking about our national security in a more integrated way. I proposed at NATO headquarters that NATO have ministerials that go beyond defense and foreign ministers and begin to include finance ministers and interior ministers, because law enforcement and finance are something that needs to be included in this. And I would say the same thing for the National Security Council here in the U.S. Why don't we bring in the Treasury Secretary and the Attorney General into these discussions, because these things are part of the national security discussion, and in this environment they need to be. I hope I didn't go over, Peter, or am I right on?
We're okay.
Good.
Because it's all really important, interesting stuff. I'm going to ask folks to be working on, as you have questions, start thinking about them now. We're going to have two great panelists. When they're done, I'm not going to ask them questions, you are. Okay, and when you do, I'm just going to ask you to stand up and introduce yourself. All right, this is a real pleasure. I get to introduce truly an old friend and frankly a mentor of mine. I consider myself one of his acolytes, Dr. Les Grau, Lieutenant Colonel retired, who is one of the sage, if you will, for us upstart younger foreign area officers, and is out there in Kansas doing God's work at the Foreign Military Studies Office. He is the established expert in the open source world for USG and defense on Afghanistan. He has published in innumerable ways and is still very, very much on the fight. He's going to talk to you more organically about the Russian military. And without further ado, Les.
Thank you very much, Peter. Yeah, push the button. The one thing you told me to do, and I did. It's truly an honor to be here. I want to thank Jeff Swan for the invitation. I remember him as Major Swan and Major Zwack back in the day. I've been at Fort Leavenworth for a long time. I started the great trek back in 1966 as Second Lieutenant Grau at Fort Benning School for Wayward Boys, and volunteered for Vietnam, so they sent me to Berlin. And of course, Berlin was surrounded by these guys called Soviets, which was nothing like the Op-4. And I tried to find out what the Soviets would actually do, but that was all highly classified. And through this, I discovered the magic world of open source, and I've been with it for quite a few years now. So everything I have is from the Russian perspective. It's what they say. And my experience says that the Russians are never as good as they say they are or as bad as we say they are. Russia is the comeback kid. They lost 5 million people. They lost 30% of their territory. They had an economic downturn, hell, they had an economic crisis that was worse than our depression. And they went from 50% to 82% ethnic Russian, and they are paranoid as anything. They are surrounded by hostility, as Peter pointed out, and we don't really appreciate that. Our neighbors are fairly nice. We've invaded Canada 3 times. It never worked out. They're too tough. We gave up. And Mexico, we invaded, well, about 3 times as well, and we kept a lot of that. So, but we're not worried about our borders the way they are, and they are worried in 360 degrees, and yes. Back before the whole thing collapsed, I was reading in the open source about the Soviet view of future war, and future war was going to be nonlinear because high precision weapons were out there in the future and they were going to tear things apart. You were going to have a less dense battlefield with more lethality that was connected, that was capable of integration from long distances. You were talking about combined arms battalions. That was in the 90s. This was thought then. This is the point they are trying to get at now. Russia has always had 2 armies. One, a European army, and one for the South and Asia. And trying to balance between those 2 has always driven them a little bit nuts. And trying to keep current in both has been a challenge. They have always been an artillery army with a lot of tanks. Fire enables maneuver. And while the West has gone very rapidly to the realm of precision surgical fire, they have done it, but they have not abandoned mass fire. Because one of the things they feel that mass fire gives is psychic terror. And when you have reduced that steely-jawed combat infantryman in his fighting position as he crawls up to what used to be the top of his fighting position, trying to find his aiming stakes, trying to clear his weapon, having lost control of his bladder, and crying like a little lad is when the tanks go over him. Fire enables maneuver. And so when you're looking for how you fight, you're going to fight on a extended nonlinear battlefield where you cover your flanks with artillery, with strong points, with counterattacks. It is going to be a cav fight. And they are organized for the cav fight. We had the Serdyukov reforms, the most amazing reforms in the last 100 years since the Miliutin reforms. And wow, all the old Cold War thinking went down in order to build these smaller, more mobile units that can be moved quickly. Divisions are great in combat. They have a lot of staying power, but getting them there is a problem. Brigades are a lot more flexible, and when you're tied to a rail system, when you're tied to barge systems and a limited road system, they make a heck of a lot of sense. And what does the brigade look like? A maneuver brigade, depending whether it is 4 maneuver battalions, either 3 motorized rifle and 1 tank, or 3 tank, 1 motorized rifle. 4 artillery battalions. 2 air defense battalions. So now you've got a lethal fire and maneuver force that can keep an air defense bubble over your force and keep the other guy's air force off of you. He's got an engineer battalion, he's got a support battalion, and he has a radio electronic combat company. Now, you think about how many radio electronic companies we have in our brigades versus theirs, and I agree with our 2 previous speakers. They have been re-looking their tactics and operations. They prepare for their most threatened situation. Their most threatened situation is conventional maneuver war under nuclear threatened conditions. That's war in Europe primarily. How do you make this happen? So most of their training is directed into that area. However, there are other things out there because their most likely threat is internal unrest or skirmishes on your borders with various participants, and we've seen most of them. The Russian army is learning a great deal from what's going on in Syria, and they are bringing those lessons in, more for your Southern Army than for your European Army. They are postured in the Arctic. Who's going to fight them in the Arctic? They're concerned. And you've got to remember that in the Russian thought pattern, that cold weather is normal. You fight in cold weather. It's not a time when you go put all your vehicles in the shed and go do other things. And during the past 4 years, they have had 3 major riverine exercises in the Arctic. Huh? What other power has conducted riverine exercises in the Arctic? But they go up the Yenisei to the port of Dubinsk and land. They bring destroyers up the Yenisei to provide artillery support. They're getting the combined arms piece, or the joint piece, together, working ground forces, airborne, special forces, Air Force, Navy in the Arctic. These are challenges for the future. Do they have problems? Oh, you bet. One of their big problems is if you go to war in Europe, what do you do after the first 30 days? Where are the reserves? And one of the things that disappeared over the past 30 years was a competent reserve system. They are working like crazy. They have gone through several reiterations and for a reserve, at which point I will shut my mouth. Thank you very much.
I have to be honest, for me, this is a dream panel because I have not only just real area experts, but great friends. I have another one over there on the far right, Dr. Katherine Dale, who I've known since Afghan days and before. Another person that I think is going to give you some real perspectives based on long experience in a lot of lanes. Currently, she's at Army Futures Command as a senior advisor. Before that, she was a number of years at the RAND Corporation as the senior, if you will, Russia director there. From Moscow when I was there, we talked a lot, okay? Talk to your think tanks. They can really help you. And then prior to that, she was SACUR's senior advisor. And I think that was for 2 SACURs. I mean, I think you had General Breedlove for starters. And so quite an impressive portfolio. She, based on her perch at Army Futures Command, she's going to kind of give you a perspective from where she sits, looking at Russia. And Katherine, without further ado, to you.
Peter, thank you for such a lovely introduction. Some of those kind words, at least, were true. And thank you so much to AUSA for bringing this together. It is always a pleasure to be here. Good morning, I think it still is, to everyone, including out on the net. Really a privilege to have the chance to join such amazing colleagues to talk about the challenges posed by both Russia and China and the implications for our ground forces. As Peter said, I do come at this topic with 2 hats. As a very old Russia hand, in fact, Peter and I were running around in the waning days of the Soviet Union about the same time and in some of the same places. And then I'm also, again, have the privilege of being a member of the team at the fairly new Army Futures Command, which was created to help make sure that our Army and our nation can contend with the major challenges that we're facing. I want to draw on both of these hats today. And what I'm going to do is touch on the problem, the solution, and then some big questions that we still need to tackle together. The bad news is that I am the very last formal speaker standing between all of us and lunch. The good news is my colleagues have already said all of the great ideas, and also I'm hungry, so this is going to be brief and to the point. First of all, the problem, and boy, we do have a problem. Here I would say, Houston, we have a problem, except that it might jinx things. So instead, I'll just say that we do face we have a problem with Russia at multiple levels, as my colleagues have so ably described already. At the operational level, we do have a Russia that enjoys overmatch in some arenas today. It's a Russia that is also making smart modernization choices. They do not have infinite wells of economic resources, but they're choosing in smart ways to be able to move forward, to build incrementally where they can't build dramatically, and to try to stay ahead. They are also exploring emerging technologies with the intent to apply them. We hear a lot about hypersonics, for example. We already see what Russia does in the electronic warfare and cyber arenas. So they are not static, they are moving, and they're determined. At the strategic level, I would argue we have an even bigger Russia problem, and that's really the world that I come out of. We have a Russia that is deeply dissatisfied with the current order of things. As Brian described it, this is a systemic challenge, not something new. In many ways, it's no wonder if we look at recent history from a Russian strategic perspective, right? The Cold War ended, but Russia has been very consistent about its concerns. The West has pretty consistently also not listened. So the Cold War ends, we offer Russia a strategic security partnership, but it was a junior partnership. In the economic arena, we offer Russia some ties, but it was at the price of shock therapy and rampant unemployment and insecurity. In the political arena, we applauded the emergence of Russian democracy, but we did that by sending in our own experts to build a civil society for Russia in our own image. Talk about grievances. We stoked some of those. When Russia looks out from Moscow, as others have said, very much feels surrounded, and indeed on all sides, right? You have NATO to the west. You have, in many ways, as NATO takes on and focuses on a northern dimension, you have NATO to the north as well. When you look out to the east, you have China as an increasingly rising power with greater durability and staying power than Russia can muster. And then there's the Middle East, which continues to be restive and poses what is a huge, considered to be a huge existential threat for Russia, the ability to export terrorism home into Russia itself. I would argue and I think this is in keeping with my colleagues, that Russia today has 5 big strategic goals. It is first and foremost about protecting Russia itself. That is the leader, it's the regime, and it's the territory. Second, Russia is deeply concerned about its periphery. That periphery, in many instances, is an integral part of Russia itself. That's how the world looks from Moscow. Ukraine is Russia. That not their quote, not mine. But key to that, it is about reestablishing a different order on the world stage. It is fourth about making sure you've got the access you need, air, sea, and otherwise, to protect the order that you're trying to create. And fifth and finally, I believe that Russia tries to confound us for its own sake, because this is, after all, a game. And in that regard, Russia, again, is remarkably consistent. They play to win. Of course you leverage all the instruments of national power. Of course you get away with whatever you can get away with. You lie, cheat, and steal if you have to, because that is how great powers play. What do you not get? And oh, by the way, they believe firmly and adamantly that, of course, we do the same thing. Last thing in the world that Russia wants is to fight an all-out campaign against us. But it could happen. It could happen, most likely of all, through miscalculation. And I believe that danger is growing because we're actually understanding each other less and less well all of the time. Second, let me switch to the solution. The best solution is to create such a compelling deterrent that we never have to fight. And of course, making sure that we can fight and win if we have to is part of the deterrent that we need to create. This is where, again, why worlds come together, because Army Futures Command was designed as part of that solution. Army Futures Command is an enormous bet by the U.S. Army on the future. Creating a brand new Army Command and making all of these major organizational changes is a big play, and even bigger is boldly announcing our intentions to the world so that we can be held accountable for it. But that's part of the picture. Army Futures Command, our mission is to modernize the Army and make sure that we become a persistently modernizing organization. That includes some very basic things. It's understanding the future operational environment. It's developing the right concepts. It is shaping the Army's organizational structures. It's developing the capabilities that we need for the future fight. And then, oh, by the way, we're never done. And that may be the hardest part, because the mandate is to continue to draw on the very best emerging thinking, the best science and technology to feed our concepts and our capabilities development. There is no end state. This is a commitment for the long term. We are keenly aware that Russia and also China are watching everything we do. In fact, they probably see us better than we see ourselves much of the time. That's actually fine. There's a great opportunity in that. Third and finally, the questions, right? So this is the hard part. It's turning the lens on ourselves, asking hard questions, what the things that we have not fully resolved yet. And here I look forward to what I hope will be, not just today, but an ongoing, vibrant discussion. So a few that have been on my own mind. First of all, is Army Futures Command an appropriate response to strategic competition? We are certainly driven by our national defense strategy. It's aimed squarely at great power competition, and there's no compelling deterrent without the Army as part of the mix. Look, not least, especially from a Russian perspective, as we've been describing, Russia gets the role of the Army in the fight, and that, in addition to all else, makes us essential. Now, the thing is, a modernized U.S. Army is only going to be effective and part of an effective deterrent if we're part of the joint force. Russia pays very close attention to our seams. Can we do what we say? Do we have the architecture and the concepts, the organizational constructs, the mindset to fight as a joint force? Any sensor, any shooter, any C2 node in near real time, can we actually do that? That it's important to make sure our own house is in order. Second, how much is enough or maybe too much? Look, for those of us who've been deeply immersed in Europe in recent years, we've thought a lot about how much is enough, particularly in terms of force posture forward in Europe. When is it that Russia starts to care? Operationally, it gets pretty clear that Russia recognizes real war-fighting capability. In recent years, talking to the retired Russian general officer community, they looked at our enhanced forward presence battle groups initially, right? And initially, we got great soldiers from a bunch of our nations out on the ground, but initially they weren't enabled and didn't have air, and we didn't have the C2 architecture to actually fight those units. And Russian retired general officers looked at that and kind of shrugged their shoulders. On the other hand, when we're enabled and we've got air and we've got fires speak, boy, and they look at that and that registers. For example, up at the strategic level, look, we've debated fiercely among ourselves this year. How much do we need to make Russia sit up and take notice and know that we're serious? How much is too much and that it might drive Russia to hasty action? That's a very good debate in theory, except that what if there's no sweet spot at the end of the day? What if already and long since Russia feels provoked, and yet we're still not at a point where Russia thinks better of every potential hostile action? We know that they don't, because at least in the non-kinetic realm, Russia is playing hard and coercing every day. There's no easy answer to this. It's an art as well as a science. We should be asking the same question about capabilities as well as force posture. What does Russia need to see, right, in order to not start something in the first place? And then how is that going to change against a timeline? Third, and a great match to the overall topic today, how do we contend with two major challengers at once? It's one of the toughest things for our Army, as well as our nation, that we've got not one, but two potential peer challengers. Our brand new Army modernization strategy tackles this directly. It calls for us to be able to do just that. And it says, look, we will be able to execute multi-domain operations against an array of scenarios in multiple theaters by 2035. That's good. There are a lot of years between now and then, and it gives us some fairly tough choices on the path to that year. For right now, for our Army, Russia is the pacing threat, and China is the emerging longer-term challenge. The thing is, any formulation like that obscures a more basic, uncomfortable fact, which is it may just be the case that we need to care about both of these challenges. If you're sitting in either theater, in Europe or in the Pacific, you are keenly aware that you may have to fight tonight. Or you may have to fight 5 years out or 10 years out or further, and we need to make sure that we've got solutions at every point along that timeline. We don't, at the end of the day, always get to choose our battles. And then a really good and important question, given our all of us who are here today, how do we do all of this together? Our adversaries do have some advantages over us, right? They are ready and willing to break the rules if they have to, and they are masters at something that we're not always very good at, which is interagency integration, the ability to direct and integrate all elements of national power to achieve strategic ends. But one of the wonderful advantages that we have over our potential adversaries is that we're not alone. If we fight, we're going to do this together. We'll do it as a U.S. joint force. We will do this as a coalition with allies and partners. Demonstrating that we're prepared to do that is an essential part of deterrence. So in practice, that means making sure that our warfighting concepts are compatible. That means having a shared view of how we would fight. And it means leveraging opportunities to collaborate as we develop capabilities. We need to maximize our interoperability. You can't invent that on the battlefield overnight either. Let's be honest, and in fact, it's important and helpful to do so. Not all allies and partners are going to buy exactly the same things in exactly the same quantities according to the exact same timeline. We don't need to. We just need to make sure that at the end of the day, we can fight together and win. Got one quick final word, and it's really the hardest question of all. As we look ahead, are we thinking creatively enough about the future? Pace of technological change is only going to speed up and continue to do so. Our adversaries will play hard and leverage everything they can to apply against us. This calls for will and commitment and also creativity about how we work together to get that future fight right. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have about 25 minutes for Q&A. If you have any other cards, let me know. I don't have names and individuals, but I'm not going to get bureaucratic on it. For the panel, who would like to take on the first question? What is the military's role in competition with Russia, or the U.S. military in competition with Russia, and how do we define winning in competition with Russia? Who'd like to tackle that? Les.
I don't study the
Okay.
I don't study the U.S. Army.
Okay.
I mean, I live around it, but the experts in the U.S. Army and what its capabilities are you guys. Basically, you've got a tough, determined opponent who takes warfare seriously. If he goes to war with us, it is going to be for survival of the nation. If he loses, that's a non-starter. So if we do go into this fight, for him, it's to the death. Or negotiate a very quick peace deal indeed. So just based on the two peoples and where we're coming from, if we lose a war with Russia and it hasn't gone nuclear, we're still pretty much intact. And they're afraid of the other side that it would not be. But I can't really speak about the U.S. Army.
Okay, I have two questions. Yes.
I mean, it's how do you define winning is simple. It's our allies and partners are safe, secure, and independent, and those include Ukraine and Georgia, as well as our NATO allies, and that we have minimized the impact of malign influence in our society. So there's a kinetic aspect and a non-kinetic aspect. That's the two ways. I mean, we're looking at a long-term systemic struggle, and we have to answer it with containment. And the end point, there isn't an end point. It's that our allies are safe, secure, and independent, and that we've minimized malign influence in our societies.
Are we winning as long as we stay below the level of our conflict?
I think absolutely, absolutely, because if we get to the level of armed conflict, that means that it's gone kinetic, and then we're in a different kind of war than the one we're in now.
Peter, may I also leap in really briefly?
Absolutely.
It's an excellent question, one of the ones teed up by AUSA for discussion today. Progress would be really welcome. I believe we're going to have to continue because it's pretty complicated. But a couple pieces. Believe that the one role for the military in competition is focuses through a loop on conflict. Part of what we need to be able to do now is establish an effective deterrent, and doing that means we've got to be able to fight and win if we need to, and that is one key piece of competition because it's a clear and unequivocal signal. But it's not enough. And as colleagues have suggested, look, this is what makes this so hard is that it is an interagency challenge. It is not primarily a military responsibility, nor should the military be in the lead. The military can play a supporting role, and again, that becomes a national conversation. We have some pretty impressive capabilities of different kinds, ones that we continue to develop, that can support an overall national effort. But it's got to be integrated. It's all instruments of national power. Again, that's something that both of these potential major adversaries are very good at. And I'm going to do one quick alibi in response to General Swan's great question. To be a little bit provocative, I might disagree. I'm not sure that the only measure of effectiveness is have we avoided major combat of some kind. Russia, at least, is playing hard. They're playing to win every day. Those actions can be and already have been sometimes profoundly destabilizing, even when Russia's not employing its military instrument. We need to ask ourselves what our core national interests are, and are those affected by things that Russia is doing short of major armed conflict? I would argue that they are, and therefore we do have a problem.
I'd like to piggyback on that because I want to concur with Katherine on that. And I mean, if we are below the level of kinetic conflict, and yet one of our allies, one or more of our allies, partners, or us have been compromised and undermined, and independence can be undermined in many different ways. We're all focused on the kinetic war in Ukraine while Russia is working through oligarchic structures in order to undermine Ukraine's independence. Georgia right now is on the brink of state capture. For those of us that pay close attention to Georgia, it's still nominally a NATO partner, but if you look at what's going on the ground there. So as long as our allies are independent and we are below the level of kinetic conflict, I would agree with that. I wouldn't want to capitulate and say we stay below the level of kinetic conflict at all costs, because that would be capitulation.
I have, we're going to hit questions quickly. I have two questions for the panel. I think I'd ask Katherine to start. How does Defender 2020 address what Russia needs to see for so-called deterrence and not tip the balance to dangerous miscalculation? Follow-on related question is, how do you think Russia will respond to Defender 2020? Katherine, could you explain very quickly to the audience what Defender 2020 is?
Peter, thank you for that, and thanks to the audience for the question. Exercise Defender 2020 is a major exercise indeed scheduled for the early part of next year, 2020, in Europe. The scale and scope are significant. And you've seen, not least in recent press coverage and from the discussions at the recent AUSA annual meeting, really what a big and important event this will be. And it'll be important because we're bringing together, it's not just our U.S. Army, it's a joint force, it's allies and partners. It is out on the ground together at scale, taking a look at, can we get to theater? Can we function at echelon? And can we do this with a wide array of capabilities? What's also interesting about Defender 2020 is that it's going to give us the opportunity to take a look at some of our emerging capabilities. At Army Futures Command, we've got our 8 cross-functional teams. I'm very happy to talk with anyone later and with more fidelity. we've teed up initially 31 signature initiatives that we are bringing online. They match our Army modernization priorities. Part of this for us is the opportunity to get out and learn, get things into the hands of soldiers, learn from what we're doing, and spur our modernization process. So that's the event. It is a big deal. It is an excellent question. How does Moscow respond? Well, first of all, Moscow will be watching very, very closely, and I mean that in every conceivable sense. Of course, we should simply anticipate that. The single biggest thing that we do, and many of us have lived this, is prevent surprise. What we do and what Russia does not do is we practice transparency. Here's what we're doing. This is what this will look like. Expect to see this on these dates. In fact, one thing we've done in exercises in the last few years is invite Russia to provide observers. Come have a look at this. They'll be observing in any case. But shoot, we practice transparency. We are not looking to say gotcha. The whole point of, the core of deterrence is strategic consistency. We will do what we say we will do. And so it's an opportunity to reinforce that as well. I think we can also anticipate, that said, again, Russia will be watching very closely. They have been learning from us since the Gulf War, and they will be taking away lessons. A smart activity on our part would be to figure out what lessons we think they are learning from this exercise. One thing it's very important to keep in mind as we look out to the future is that it's very, very interactive. We're learning from Russia, they're learning from us all the time. It's a very, very dynamic interplay.
Les, would you have a Russian perspective in how you could foresee a Russian reaction to 2020?
Well, first of all, I would say that you're going to have a psychological, propagandistic approach to they're beating the war drums, they're threatening our borders, they're threatening our way of life, they're threatening our people. I would think that there will be an increase in the Russian military press about area denial, about their long-range anti-ship missiles and everything else. And when you look at that with the concentric rings and all that, that's very impressive. But it's been my experience with concentric rings that even if your target is within that ring, doesn't mean it's dead. So, but there's going to be a great deal of that. I would expect a snap exercise of major proportions going on in all four, at that time 5 military districts, because the Northern Fleet is now going to become the head of the 5th military district. And I would say that they will be staggered. So instead of having one large event, you will have an event before, you will have an event during, you will have an event trailing. They will see it as a threat. And this is where Katherine's point of the biggest danger is miscalculation. And this is a point where miscalculation could certainly take place.
Yes, I'm going to take a question from General Swan to me because it fits right in, I think, what we're talking about. Clearly, adding more nations to the NATO alliance intimidates Russia and its view of the West. What are the advantages or disadvantages for the U.S. in a growing NATO? Very quickly, I am a absolutely hardcore believer in NATO, not just because of the Russian Federation, but because of the stability that it provides inside of Europe. There hasn't been a conflict other than Turkey and Greece and Cyprus in '74, and that matters. However, there is, and Katherine could talk hugely on this, there is NATO's policy of an open door. And that I support too, because you cannot allow another nation to set a diktat that you can't do something like enlarge NATO, which is all about nations that want to join NATO. It's not like the old Warsaw Pact. Now, we go back and forth with the Russians a lot, but they see it, as Les said, as expansionistic and as a threat. And so to answer in the near term, certainly among the countries in contact with Russia, Ukraine, whose heart is worthy, and Georgians whose heart is worthy, from a geostrategic, purely military balance of force thing. Is it the right time? Maybe not, but I support eventually having that door, relations improve with Russia, and that happens. Now, I've just come from the Balkans, where NATO is a major issue. Northern Macedonia will be coming in next year. Serbia is back and forth. The bigger issue right now for Serbia is the EU. But Serbia is also very, very concerned about the Russian perspective. But what I will tell the Russians is, look, these countries have a right to self-determination. Oh, by the way, Serbia, Montenegro, North Macedonia don't even come close to your border. So don't tell us it's a military threat. But it's deep, it's visceral, it's psychological, and certainly in whatever you would call, they call the near, broad, or privileged sphere that we see as an area that should not be interfered with. They see NATO enlargement further in that as a distinct threat. Okay, the next, please. Yeah.
I've been telling the Georgians and the Ukrainians that they have to change their marketing strategy for getting into NATO, change it away from that we need to be protected from the big bad Russians to we can be security assets for you. We can be security providers for you. And if you look at the map of the Black Sea, initially it looks great. You got NATO members, Turkey, Bulgaria, Romania. But then when you look at it a little bit closer, it doesn't look so great because, well, how reliable right now are some of those allies? And Georgia and Ukraine, I argue, could market themselves as the anchors we need on the Black Sea. Things like the Anaklia Deepwater Port in Georgia, for example, are a key component of this. So I think they need to change their marketing strategy and say, we can be security assets. I don't believe Russia has a sphere of privileged influence along its borders. These are sovereign states who can choose their alliances, in my opinion. But they need to market themselves as assets more.
Question to you, Brian. Would a 1990s style active measures working group, quote unquote, help achieve hybrid containment? Kind of getting along what you were talking about. If so, what obstacles are preventing the U.S. and its allies from creating such a working group?
But the short answer to your question is yes. I mean, I think we need to, whether we call it that again or not, I think we have to. One of the things that happened with the active measures working group was it looked at the conflict as a kinetic as well as a non-kinetic conflict, and looked at ways to counter the non-kinetic piece of this. What is stopping us from doing it right now is largely, I think, bureaucratic and institutional inertia, although the ball has moved considerably in the last couple of years. And it's also differences in threat perception, because something like this has to be a whole-of-government approach here in the U.S., but it also has to be a whole-of-government and transatlantic approach. And the threat is looked at very differently. If you're in Estonia, you see the threat a lot differently than if you're in Spain, for example. And there is a big desire in large portions of both here in the U.S., but more commonly in Western Europe, to get back to so-called business as usual with the Russians, and they see things like this as unnecessarily provocative and unnecessary. I would disagree with that, but I think we need to revive something like that. I don't know if you're going to call it that, but I think it would move the ball considerably forward that way.
For the panel, and I think this is really important before we close in just a few minutes, what changes and additional parties should we consider for inclusion in a New START treaty? Remember, friends, that New START will be heavily, if you will, discussed in 2020. And if there is not agreement with the Russian Federation, it dies in February of 2021. Friends?
Clearly China and the UK, although that's going to drive the Russians crazy because they like this bilateral Russian-American committee to save the world thing. But I think the next, I mean, when the last New START was being negotiated, most arms control experts were saying this is the last bilateral one. Future strategic nuclear arms treaties are going to have to include, at the very least, China and also most likely the UK, and I would argue potentially France. I would bring all of the major nuclear powers into this. Again, it will drive the Russians insane, but there is really no argument against this. That'd be mine.
I'll offer a thought. I think that despite the rhetoric and bluster, that the Russians are quite concerned about ICBM-focused arms control completely falling apart. INF, they could manage. The question is of course, an army has a role in this actually, is that how do you wrestle with the issues of long-range precision conventional technologies that can reach deep. And though that's not our plan, the Russians see it as a direct threat to their second strike capabilities. And so how do you wrestle with that?
No, Peter, I would agree with that. And if you looked at the Russian military press during the negotiations of New START during the Obama administration, there was all this talk of this American plot to bring nuclear weapons down to this level of minimal deterrence, which they really feared this because of our conventional superiority. And so they're worried about the strategic nuclear arms regime falling apart, but at the same time, they don't want too robust of a strategic nuclear arms regime because they know that our conventional superiority would overwhelm them, and their biggest ace in the hole right now is their nukes, which is, I loved your last slide, because Putin, in case we didn't know, loves to keep reminding everybody that he has nukes. I worry about this regime with nuclear weapons. This is the first Soviet or Russian regime since Khrushchev, which has either explicitly or implicitly engaged in kind of nuclear posturing with the West. I mean, you didn't see this during other regimes, and I worry that they don't really understand the responsibilities that go with being the custodians of a nuclear arsenal. I think they talk a little bit too loosely about their nukes, and I think this is something that should cause concern.
I worry that in a New Age Cuba type of scenario, would they blink? Les.
Just a thought, during the Cold War, one of the successes of the Cold War was that the United States and the Soviet Union managed to keep the further development and spread of nuclear weapons in check. When that ended, we had some agreements which are now in the process of having dissolved or about to. And if we're going to do something in the future, I think it's going to take concentrated leadership from both sides earnestly to make this happen. I agree with Brian that it can't be just bilateral.
Katherine?
And Peter, if I may, just two quick thoughts. Based on the contributions here from my fellow panelists, it underscores the need for a very sophisticated look at the future fight. We let ourselves sometimes think in terms of a very linear spectrum, left to right, conventional to nuclear. One of the key insights from our multi-domain operations concept, it is all domains, space, cyber, EW, land, sea, air, potentially all at once interacting in curious and interesting ways. As we look at potential adversaries, it is critical to think not only about what we see them bringing online or thinking about bringing online, but also how they might apply those things with what timing and sequencing and in what circumstances. That requires an understanding of strategic culture as well as military capabilities. Again, it's an art rather than just a science. And one quick final thought: regardless of the content of any renewed START conversation, it is critically important that we keep the channels of communication open. We do not disagree. We do not agree. We do not share a vision of the future world order, let alone how to get there. But not talking just fuels understanding each other less and less well over time. It raises the risks of miscalculation and makes it a more dangerous world.
May I take one more question from the group here? For our group here, it's from Lieutenant Colonel Trans Ruhl, Joint Staff, and it's a future question. It's an imaginative question, and I think maybe we should end on this. For the panel, if your analogy about civilizations, computer game demonstrates the Russian way, current way of changing the rules, shouldn't the U.S. compete differently also by changing the rules of the game and overtly or covertly? See this book by James Kars, Finite in Infinite Games, 1983, which regrettably I don't know the book. Any thoughts?
I guess the short answer in my instinct says no. Our systems are based on rules and institutions, and that's who we are. I mean, when we think of who the us and them is in this struggle, we are not defined by our nationality or by our ethnicity or by our race or by our geography even. A Japanese official once told me to refer to him as a Western official when he was speaking to me on background, right? We're defined by one thing and one thing only. We agree to live by these rules, and we agree to live under these institutions. That's who we are. So I don't think we should get very adept at confronting an adversary who breaks the rules and operates with subterfuge and through this kind of insidious way. But I don't think we should change our rules. If we did, we would change who we are.
I could not agree more with my colleague. That this is a definitional question about who we are. It is not only wrong, it's also not to our advantage to change the rules that we play by or to break the rules that we've agreed to and publicly professed. What we can and should do is get far more creative in how we think about potential future solutions. That means working together with all of the communities in this room who traditionally work together, right? And we've got our own army, which is all three compos. It is our joint force, it's our allies and partners, it is our traditional defense industrial partners who are critical parts of the solution, and it's a whole bunch of non-traditional counterparts, from startup communities to academics thinking in new and innovative ways. There's a lot there that we can leverage, still within the rules that we've agreed to, but that can give us advantages going forward.
Sir, with that, our panel is complete. Over to you.
Okay, thank you. Let's give